Welcome to the BRDG Technology and Ethics Conversation event on the immersive technology, telehealth, and education. A stark irony to the year 2020 was the degree to which we recognize how out of focus many of our society's systems had become, and the importance of mobilizing to make things better. As the world came to a halt, technology came roaring to save the day. We are fortunate that this pandemic struck at a time when technology is ready to assist, such as in this event. Moore's Law, established in 1965 by the Intel co-founder Gordon E. Moore, is the observation that the number of transistors on integrated circuits doubles approximately every 2 years. This has been true up to today to transistor counts and computational power. In some other cases, such as genetic sequencing, the exponential growth has been even more drastic, while at the same time, there is an exponential decrease in technology costs. As technology costs continue to decrease, college tuition costs has increased by 170% in the past 20 years, according to our World in data, which will open doors to alternative education methods. Hence, the conversation we will be having tonight. If I equate technology to a bus that at the moment is driving at 60 miles per hour, I don't see any reason why this bus would not be going 120 miles per hour in my lifetime. What I see inside the bus are highly capable, highly enthusiastic technical know-hows who are eager to solve the world's problem by inventing more technology solutions. The population inside this bus is not very diverse, especially when it comes to education background, highly technical group. If you have to be better at identifying and forecasting the unforeseen or even the unintended social issues created by new technologies, then we need to have people with diverse backgrounds in the creation of these new technologies. Basically, more diverse people inside the bus. This BRDG technology and ethic conversation is to stimulate the engagement of leadership from diverse backgrounds as we be more interested in the direction of technology advancement, with the hope that diverse involvement will mobilize collaborations to make things better. Now I'd like to turn this over to John Mislevitz, a communication consultant whose background includes nearly 2 decades serving engineering and R&D function within the Fortune 500 company. And he's also a member of our board. John.
To introduce things this morning, I'm going to now introduce our sort of MC, if you will, for tonight's event, which is who is Dr. Jeff Hittenberger. He serves as a Chief Academic Officer at the Orange County Department of Education. He has more than 30 years as an educator and has served as a teacher from the elementary school level through to the university professorship. His dedication to advancing academics includes serving in high-profile administrative positions within university, as well as public school district environments. Dr. Hittenberger has conducted research and training across the globe. South Africa, Israel, and Haiti are just a few of his stops. And he currently serves on the California Partnership Academy State Advisory Council and the California International Studies Project Advisory Board. Jeff and his wife of more than 30 years, I think very notable, Christine, are the proud parents of a daughter and a son, both of whom are products of the Orange County Public School System. And with that, I turn the reins over to Dr. Hittenberger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I appreciate that. And thank you, Cecilia, for your wonderful leadership as well. We so appreciate the work that Bridge to Connect BRDG is doing in Orange County to support students and to enhance the opportunities that they have. And we're so thankful to all of you for participating in tonight's conversation, because that's really what this is. It's a conversation with some really outstanding dialogue partners who share some common values about technology and ethics and supporting education. These are things we all share. So we really want you to feel comfortable in conversation. So for most of us, this is a fairly new field of inquiry. And some of us are more experienced in the domain. We have a keynote tonight who really can address all of these various levels of experience with the technologies. And we also represent many different sectors. There are people from the tech sector here. There are people from other business and industry sectors. There are people from higher education. There are people from K-12, lots of different backgrounds. And again, Mike Wesolowski, our speaker tonight, can address people from that broad range of sectors. Let me tell you a little bit about Mike's background. He has over a decade of experience leading high-performance teams in science, innovation, and technology development. He's an entrepreneur, multidisciplinary researcher, and a passionate advocate of the concept of using tech for good. Mike is the co-founder and CEO of Luxsonic Technologies. He leads a growing team of healthcare experts, medical professionals, and software developers that share a common mission. And John mentioned this, their mission earlier, to improve global access to healthcare through immersive technology, ultimately for the purpose of bettering society. In addition to leading Luxsonic, Mike is also a multidisciplinary scientist and an enthusiastic mentor. He received his PhD in physics from the University of Waterloo and holds an adjunct professorship in medical imaging at the University of Saskatchewan. He has co-authored over 35 academic publications in fields ranging from astrophysics to radiology. His current research group focuses on the development, evaluation, and integration of innovative technologies in medical imaging. Super impressive, Mike. We are so glad that you're with us. Let's give a warm Zoom hand clap welcome to Mike Wesolowski.
Everyone. I am very honored to be here. Thank you so much to the BRDG committee for the invite to speak this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm super excited and I'm really looking forward to the interactive discussion and panel afterwards. So let me take this opportunity to share my screen and we'll get started with the presentation. So today I'm going to be discussing mainly the application of immersive technologies in healthcare, but a lot of the learning today will be applicable across the board in many different fields. And I look forward during the panel discussion to talk about some of the other fields that immersive technology is being used in. So, $8 trillion. That's the amount of money that we spend globally on healthcare every single year. That is, to me, a shocking number. But what's more shocking is the fact that we spend $8 trillion a year on healthcare, but over half the world's population doesn't have access to even the most basic healthcare service. So think about that. That's $8 trillion a year, and 4 billion people don't have access to healthcare services. So how do we solve this problem? You know, a lot of very intelligent people think about this problem all of the time. And there are some more obvious answers. So in order to improve access to healthcare, one of the things that we can do is create more healthcare workers. If you have more healthcare workers, then we can improve access to healthcare. The WHO has suggested that we need to train 30 million more healthcare workers by 2030 just to meet current demands. So we're not even really touching on those 4 billion people who don't have access to healthcare. Just to keep up with demand, we need to train 30 million more healthcare workers around the world. Easy, right? We have medical training systems in place. We have the internet. We have all of this technology. But traditional healthcare education hasn't really been scalable. And by all estimations, we are going to miss that 30 million number by about 18 million healthcare workers if we continue to do things the way we've been doing them. So why isn't healthcare training scalable? Well, medical training requires lots of resources. If I wanted to train a sonographer, I need sonography equipment. I need consumables. I need a clinical environment in which to train them in. So medical training requires lots and lots of resources. Medical training is also hands-on. Once you're done in the classroom, you need to apply all of the knowledge that you've learned and use that knowledge in real clinical settings before you're allowed to interact with patients on your own. So all of the knowledge that you've gained in the classroom really has to be applied hands-on. And we have to train people in using those hands-on skills, which again is difficult to scale using traditional technology. Both of those features of medical training really make medical training also very expensive and time-consuming. But I think one of the biggest issues that we face in terms of scaling medical training globally is that so far, much of the medical training that we have is really unequally distributed. And by that, I mean, training centers are typically in urban settings. And the reason that this can be a significant problem, there's been a lot of research that shows that by having medical training in urban centers, even if you have folks who are from remote and rural areas and they can actually afford to get their medical training in an urban center, once they receive that training, they very rarely go back to the rural area. And so research has shown if we can provide that training that's more centered around rural areas and centered in rural areas, people tend to stay in those areas. And healthcare access and healthcare training becomes more equally distributed around the world. So my thesis for today is really that we can use technology to solve this scalability problem in healthcare training. And specifically, I think immersive technology addresses many of the issues that are preventing us from really scaling out medical training around the world and in small rural areas. So I love this picture because for me, immersive technologies were really the first immersive technology I was exposed to was books. And I think this really captures the essence of what I mean when I say books are immersive technology. When you read a book, you're really transported to a different time or a different place. And that's really what we're trying to do with modern day immersive technologies like this. we're trying to create within the user the perception that they're physically present. They're actually within a digital world. And that has a lot of power. It's ironic that, for me, books are really the first immersive technology, because the first description of modern day, what we consider modern day virtual reality and augmented reality, was first described in a book back in the 1930s. Stanley Weinbaum published Pygmalion Spectacles back in 1935. It's a short science fiction story in which the protagonist meets a crazy professor who's created a set of goggles that can transport you to a fantasy realm, and you can live out a complete fantasy life. And that was really the first description of what we consider to be modern virtual reality and immersive technology. Since then, we've made dramatic progress. In the 1950s and 60s, we had the first patents that were issued for immersive technology. And in fact, this is a patent from 1960. You can see on the left-hand side here, it looks very similar to the headset that I have sitting on my desk. In the 1960s, throughout the 60s, we started actually developing these headsets. And in the late 60s, 1968, I believe, we had the first headset, the head-mounted display called the Sword of Damocles, which hung from the ceiling. It was so heavy, it had to hang from the ceiling, otherwise it would crush the user. But that was the first time where we displayed completely digital information within a headset like this. In the 1970s, we started exploring interactive spaces where the user could interact with the space and the space could interact back with the user. In the 1980s, we started using virtual reality and augmented reality for training purposes. NASA began using this technology for training and for telerobotic control. The 90s were a very interesting time because in the 90s, we started to see the first consumer virtual reality. And that opened up the floodgates. Even though consumer virtual reality was a failure from a commercial standpoint in the 1990s, what it allowed us to do is actually start using virtual reality for training and for education. And it sparked a massive amount of research looking at how we could use this technology for training and for education. In the 2000s, we started to be able to immerse ourselves in the world around us. So with Google Street View back in 2007, it was the first time that we could click on a map and actually have a 360-degree picture of the street we grew up on as a child. And then in the late 2010s, we started to really see the resurgence of consumer virtual reality. And with the Oculus Rift, we saw the first real commercial success with consumer VR. And since then, we've pumped in billions of dollars into the technology to get to where we are today, which is a completely mobile headset that's extremely high fidelity. So we've come a long way since Weinbaum's first description, but really we're only now sort of realizing that vision that he had back in 1935. So I thought I'd take a few minutes to, in the interest of our conversation later, to get some common vernacular. You may hear words like augmented reality, AR, VR, virtual reality, mixed reality, extended reality. So I thought it would be useful to sort of talk a little bit about these three branches of immersive technology. So for me, augmented reality really is the digital overlay of the real world, the digital overlay of information on the real world. In this particular case, we see a gentleman wearing Microsoft HoloLens, and he can see his environment, but in addition to that, he sees several portions of anatomy. You may be familiar with other types of augmented reality, like mobile augmented reality. One of the most famous examples of that is Pokemon Go, and that's been a huge consumer success. But I would sort of call that augmented reality light. With virtual reality, we're actually creating fully digital worlds. And this is really where, for medical training and for training in general, we see a huge amount of application. So that resource problem that we talked about in healthcare earlier starts to go away using virtual reality. We can create fully interactive clinical simulations. We can create consumables, and we can create equipment within the virtual space, really at very little cost, certainly a much lower cost than the comparable physical environment. And finally, we have mixed reality, and Microsoft may disagree with me on the definition of this because they seem to call everything mixed reality. But for me, mixed reality is really the blending of the digital and real world interactions. So this is an application from a company called Fundamental Surgery. We have no affiliation with them, but it's a great example of what I consider mixed reality. In this case, we see a student who's actually using a haptic feedback device. And this student is within a virtual reality simulation. So that haptic feedback gives them another level of immersion so that they can actually touch and feel within the virtual realm. And so that's how I tend to define mixed reality. So why do we use and why do I think that immersive technologies can really solve this problem of improving access to healthcare training? Really, this technology has a few critical superpowers. The first one being accessibility. So as I mentioned, we can create fully digital environments, and we can share those environments anywhere in the world with an internet connection. These headsets are becoming lighter and easier to procure and send. So it's much easier to send a headset around the world than it is to try and send a medical school. So the reality is that with this type of technology, because we can simulate at a fairly low cost entire training scenarios, we can improve the accessibility of this type of content. Again, it's a very low resource technology, so we can create these resources within the virtual world and share them. These clinical scenarios and these training scenarios can be very interactive. So when we're talking about hands-on training in medicine, we can interact with virtual patients. We can have those hands-on experiences with clinical environments and really mimic the real world in a way that hasn't been possible up until now. This type of training leads to efficiencies. So because we don't have to schedule the use of resources, because this type of technology can be accessed from your own home at any time, it leads to efficiencies within the training environment. And as I mentioned, we've had about 30 years of research looking at this technology and its effectiveness. And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But the technology itself is very effective in providing benefits for training and education. And finally, the technology is becoming much more affordable. Immersive tech for an all-in-one headset is $299 US, and you can pack an entire medical training system into a headset like that. So in terms of effectiveness, as I mentioned, immersive technologies really do improve on a lot of areas in training and education. So what we've found over these last 30 years of research is that training within the virtual world is much faster than within the classroom. Humans are three-dimensional beings. We interact with the world. It's three-dimensional. So, if I can reach out and grab an anatomy and really interact with that in a way that I'm used to, understanding that anatomy becomes much faster than it does from a textbook. Because as a trainee, I can train on my basic clinical skills, for example, and I can do that training over and over again in a safe environment. I develop greater confidence in applying those skills afterwards when compared to just trying to learn skills in a classroom. Being immersed in an environment allows me to become more emotionally connected to content. So much more so than learning the content from a classroom. When you're in an immersive environment or a clinical simulation, you're forming memories in a very similar way that you would if you were actually experiencing that in real life. So you become emotionally connected to the content. We also found that knowledge retention in immersive training is actually better than e-learning, for example. Students are also more focused when they're in an immersive environment. You really can't look at your phone. You're not distracted by by your email or by a web page. You're really in the environment and you're focused on what you're learning. And finally, as I've mentioned, at scale, immersive technologies actually are significantly less expensive to distribute than classroom learning. So we've gone through some of the superpowers of immersive technology, why they're effective, and I wanted to show that, in fact, these technologies are being used right now for medical training in many different fields of medicine. So there are about 30 medical professions that are certified within North America. And we're already using immersive technology for training of EMTs. There are dozens of companies that have been created around the surgical space and surgical training, training within other subdisciplines like pharmacy, nursing, optometry, rad tech. I envision a world in the not too distant future where almost all of medical training in all of these 30 subdisciplines can benefit from immersive technologies. And as we're winding down our conversation, I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about some of the work that we're doing. So at Luxsonic, we've been developing a product for radiologists and radiology trainees. If you've ever gotten an ultrasound or a X-ray, once you leave the hospital, that digital data is passed to a radiologist. And the radiologist spends basically their entire day, 80 or 90% of their day, in what we call a radiology reading room. And effectively, that's a room that's full of fairly expensive equipment, but it's multiple monitors, and the radiologist spends their day reviewing imaging case data. By its nature, radiology training is very collaborative. So in this picture, you see two radiologists, or a radiologist and a trainee, and this is a very common view of radiology education. Typically, you'll have a radiology resident sitting next to the radiologist in their reading room, exploring cases, understanding, learning, and a really side-by-side mentor-mentee relationship. Now, with COVID, this has been challenging, and what we've been building effectively is a virtual version of that entire room. So we've taken the concept of the radiology reading room and virtualized it, put it in a headset like this. And that's turning out to be very powerful right now, when radiologists and residents and radiologists and students can't be in the same physical space. What they can do, though, is they can share the virtual space. So we've created a system that's really integrated within the clinical workflow, which is extremely important for adoption, made that system very accessible and collaborative, and in doing so, have allowed radiology education to continue even during this pandemic. But the application here is much greater than just the pandemic itself. With all of this technology, allowing it to be collaborative and accessible really opens up the possibilities for training around the world, so that we're not just training people here in North America, we can train people from anywhere in the world collaboratively. So I wanted to finish off very briefly a look at the future of immersive technology. So this is a scene from the movie Ready Player One. And we're not really too far off from this scene, really. We're developing haptic feedback gloves. Right now, they're being integrated into technology, which will allow us to really feel the virtual world. And that has huge impacts on our training, because medical training is so hands-on. Being able to really feel things in the virtual world expands out our applicability hugely. The technology on the headsets is becoming smaller, thinner, lighter. We're even doing things like scanning people's faces in real time, so that we can create true to life avatars to really impact the immersion and collaborative aspects of this technology. So the future that was presented in Ready Player One is, based in 2040, but I think we're actually getting pretty close to that already. So to summarize, again, over half the world's population doesn't have access to basic healthcare services. And what I'm proposing is that we're already using immersive tech to help solve this problem by improving access to healthcare training. And I will leave it with you right there.
And now I'm delighted to introduce our two panelists who are going to join Mike for a little round of conversation. I'm delighted, first of all, to introduce Amy Kaufman, who is the Director of Career Education and Workforce Development for the CEO Leadership Alliance of Orange County. Amy's also a faculty member for the Department of Education and Community Outreach at UC San Diego, and a leader in the field of immersive technologies in education. Amy believes artificial intelligence and immersive technologies are a through line for innovation industries and education. And by intentionally preparing the talent pipeline now, greater opportunities will be created for all humans to thrive in the innovation age. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you,
Amy was the one who introduced us to Mike, too. So thank you very much for that, Amy. Our next panelist is Tony Sarris. Tony is Executive Director of Tech Coast Angels, Orange County. Tony has spent the majority of his career working with advanced technologies, primarily those focused on data and artificial intelligence. He's worked in early stage and growth startups as a CTO and head of software development, in IT consulting, in corporate entrepreneurship and new ventures, and most recently as executive director of Tech Coast Angels, one of the longest operating and largest angel investing groups in the United States. When not working, you can find him hiking, gardening, or on the beach. Very good. Welcome, Tony. Let's welcome Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the panel. Amy and Tony, we're going to bring Mike into the conversation as well, but would you two start by sharing with us a bit about your journey with immersive technologies, and how did you come to discover these technologies and use them in your work? And Amy, would you start for us, and then we'll go to Tony.
Sure. So I'll share for the purpose of the group that Dr. Hittenberger and I, Jeff and I, have a long-standing relationship. We have worked together through the Orange County Department of Education. And hello, Vern Burton. So nice to see your face. The reason I bring that to your attention is that Jeff and I were doing work at a period of time around the industrial revolutions, because we were looking to see how career pathways were going to evolve. And so we really got into the second industrial revolution about electricity, and the third industrial revolution about technology. And then there was the fourth industrial revolution. But as all this information started coming to the forefront, what I began to see is that there's going to be the technology, that's the electricity or the internet, that's going to happen now, that is going to profoundly change the way we live, the way we work, the way we educate, the way we play. And so Vern was one of the very first people who even embraced this concept of like, I know what we could do, because so many of our good conversations start that way. But that's how I became aware of it and involved with it, and then went on to become, the chapter president for the VR/AR Association in Orange County and the University and Colleges Committee as well. So the worlds converged, and it was a great convergence.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And Tony, how about you? How did you come into this world?
My background originally was in manufacturing systems, and so I came about through looking for ways to sort of augment people building complex things like aerospace and defense type products, and how to make them more effective to be able to sort of take the instructions and the bill of materials and make it easier for them to know how to assemble these complex products, and also how to design them in a 3D sort of design aspect. And so later on then I began to specialize in artificial intelligence. And so that whole area, sort of how can you create virtual assistants and other entities that have the knowledge base that humans have, but also are operating in the same context that we are, so that you can interact with them in a real world environment. So I'm fascinated by the use of avatars and things like that for educational training related uses, as well as even entertainment kinds of things as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Tony. We want to explore a little bit how these technologies, immersive technologies in particular, might affect and change education in the coming years. Let's say over the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. Mike, you started talking a little bit about that, but could you elaborate a little bit more on that, and then maybe Amy and Tony, if you would want to weigh in on that as well. How might immersive technologies impact the way we do education and training in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think one of the areas where we'll see the biggest impact is access to environments and scenarios. So, for example, giving a high school student access to a radiologist, allowing them to sit with a radiologist in a virtual workflow, taking them through through their day and what it looks like to be in this profession, I think, is something that we can unlock very easily with immersive technologies. So yeah, access to environments that may be challenging to have have access to right now, I think is one way that we'll see an improvement using immersive technologies.
I'd like to expand on that if I could.
Tony,
I think
please.
when you talk about access to environments, I think this will be a great way for rural areas that don't have necessarily the financial means or the access to the real world technologies to be able to take advantage of the virtual environments and actually be on a more level playing field. And from a general education perspective, if you think about it, imagine if you're somewhere in the heartland and you want to be an oceanographer. Before you basically had to just read books about the ocean or whatever, and maybe go in a laboratory setting and experiment with an aquarium. But this would potentially put you in a way where you could experience a lot of what somebody who's on one of the coasts could do. So, to me, it opens up an opportunity for people who either for financial or proximity or whatever reasons wouldn't have access, as Mike said, to the real world. So how can we get them a fairly comparable access to a virtual world where they can experience things and do that experiential learning?
Sure.
So access to experiences that people might not otherwise be able to have of a variety of kinds. Amy, I know you've worked a lot on this with career pathways and in other settings. What comes to mind for you?
So naturally, as we've all said here, that diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, look at how we have now opened up the world of possibilities to inclusively collaborate, to provide equity to opportunities that perhaps we couldn't before, and then diversity as well, because now you have this global reach where you can bring people from all over the world, different cultures, different regions. So that's incredibly exciting. But also too, when you just mentioned that, Tony, I think about the power of storytelling. In addition to that, we now have the ability to tell the very, very important stories that we don't ever want people to forget in a way that now they can absorb it and continue then to be storytellers themselves, that we just don't want our future generations to ever forget.
That's great, Amy, and it gets at beyond the technological function of immersive technology. There's the human dimension that you can get at with stories, and I'd like to mention one as well. And Amy referred to Vern Burton, who's one of our participants today, and Vern is principal of a school here in Orange County that serves students in alternative education. And in many cases, these are students for whom traditional education has not been a great fit and who perhaps have run into credit, fall behind on credits, something like that. And Vern is currently working on a pilot program with the Peace Literacy Institute that will use VR to give instruction in things like conflict resolution, de-escalation, kind of a host of these, what we think of as social and emotional, but within a VR context that, especially while students are doing remote learning, gives them access to each other and to an instructor to work through these crucial life issues in a virtual environment. So really excited about Vern's leadership of that project, but it gives you a sense of sort of the range of uses within education that these technologies might be able to provide. Other further down the road, let's look 10 years down the road. What happens then? Mike, when you look out long term, how does it look down the road with these technologies in education and training?
I think they become ubiquitous. And they just become part of the education and training environment. It becomes much easier for us to access those technologies, but also, they become easier to use, and they're to such an extent that they are really, truly ubiquitous. And just like when I was going through, I had textbooks in my book bag or my backpack. We'll have VR headsets, I think.
Yeah, all of us will be using our VR headsets for whatever we're doing 10 years from now, right? Good. Amy, Tony, you guys want to add to that? 10 years down the road, what does it look like?
I think things will get more realistic, certainly. I mean, some of the VR things right now are fairly realistic, and I think to the degree that they aren't realistic, it has positive and negatives. For example, kids who are doing VR games, first-person shooter kind of things, I like the fact maybe that it isn't realistic, too realistic, right? But then you kind of go, well, maybe if it was more realistic, maybe they would appreciate more the dangers of that, or the risks associated with that. But I think on the positive side, we'll be able to get to where we can really create an environment where people will feel like they're in, and maybe it's adding additional, somebody mentioned tactile or sounds and other, just the whole experiential thing of being in a different context. And I have a son who's in training for law enforcement, and I think it'd be great if you could put him, for example, in the shoes of a protester, and how that protester feels uncomfortable around the law enforcement, and then switch the roles and put a protester in the police role, and feel like the responsibility they have, and the concern they have about whether they're overstepping lines and boundaries. And so I think to be able to get to the point where we have the systems at the level where we can build in empathy, that'll be great. But it can also, we have to be careful that we don't put people in situations that are so uncomfortable that we cause them trauma or fright or whatever, even if it's in a completely virtualized environment.
Yeah. Amy.
From a technology standpoint, the abilities that we've gained even over the last couple of years to do what's called volumetric capture, we are headed towards holographic hanging out together. We are headed towards meetings where we can be around a global table and have that feeling of being with one another when maybe we could not. And then we have the ability to capture our great storytellers who are going to tell these stories, like write the words from their mouths, so that our students of the future can have those experiences as well. I can't wait for that.
So basically the Star Trek holodeck is where we're heading, Amy?
I think kind of, yeah.
Okay, very good. All right, there's one other dimension of this that the breakout groups sort of touched on in the second question that I'd like to hear from you guys on. And Tony actually alluded to it in his response. That is, as the technology gets more and more sophisticated, the visuals get better and better, you're more completely in that world. What are the potential ethical issues that arise with this technology, either along those lines or in other dimensions that come to mind for you guys? What are your ethical concerns or things that we need to pay attention to and prepare for?
Can I start us off? And
Please do, Mike.
So I want to actually piggyback off of Tony's point about empathy. One of the things that we've found with social media as it stands today is kind of the opposite of empathy. Really, we're creating these bubbles where there's not a diversity of ideas. You're sort of fixed in this one bubble of ideas. And I think if immersive technology follows that pathway, it could be extremely dangerous, because you could end up with in situations in the virtual world where people are living out their darkest fantasies, where they lack any empathy, and I think that's an ethical concern for me. I think we're all good people sitting around the virtual table right now, but it's the capacity for us to really go down some dark pathways in a visceral way is there with immersive technologies.
Yeah, that really resonates, Mike. You think back to how optimistic we felt about social media at one point, like, hey, everybody
Yeah.
can share the truth from, their perspective.
Yeah.
And that's turned out quite differently than we might have expected. And so I think a cautionary tale in a way, and thinking about what do we do about that is a difficult question. Tony and Amy, your thoughts on those ethical dimensions?
Well, it's interesting. Someone in our breakout mentioned that Deepak Chopra was doing a sort of VR series, and the experience would be you with one of the top meditative guru health people, and not everyone could be able to experience that. But it brought up the question sort of avatars, and do they live beyond? Who owns the likeness of the person in that avatar? And could someone, let's say you're a celebrity, could someone create an avatar of you in a VR setting and misuse that, for all sorts of things that Mike was mentioning that might be extremely negative uses of your avatar. I mean, there's negative uses right now of likeness. Someone brought up deep fake videos, but if you now take it to the level of completing this whole VR world, it adds insult to injury if it's misused, really.
Yeah, great point, Tony. Amy, your thoughts?
So for our group, we resonated largely around security and privacy concerns, and the immediate ones come to mind: the security and privacy of our students and keeping our children safe. But Ernest brought up as well, with the work that he does with the federal government, works with people literally in the field, which could be the battlefield. If what that person is seeing is not the reality of how they're making decisions, you now have this ability to change the course of events in a way that might not be good, or might not be the intended purpose of the person making the decisions.
Yeah, great observations, Amy. I want to remind the group, our participants, if you have a question you'd like to ask, feel free to put it in chat to Bill, and Bill is monitoring those. Bill, do you have anything yet that you'd like to read out for us that the Mike or the panelists could respond to?
Sure, I have several things here, in fact, and not in any particular order, but one of the things that you've kind of been talking about a little bit is a question here on what is the potential for hacking into VR systems? Are they well protected, or could they be protected? As other systems we know now are big on cyber crime. So I don't know, whenever you want to attack that one.
Thoughts on that?
I don't have the technical knowledge to apply, but I can say there's a new career pathway. There's a new job. There is a job of the future right there.
Cybersecurity is an incredible career pathway right now. You add this immersive technology dimension to it, and it's
immersive
like, wow.
Tech security. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think with these connected systems, we're still using the backbone of the internet. So a lot of the cybersecurity that we have available to us today, it is relevant here. But ultimately, if you're not working on securing your application, then you probably should be. But there's no guarantee in security, I guess.
And regulatory comes into mind too. I mean, digital rights management in video technology sort of applies to the content here too, right? I mean, I would think, and privacy laws as they exist too would cover, but now we've got additional privacy things because it's not just your data, it's literally your likeness and maybe your motions and your personality or whatever you've got to protect as well too.
Yeah, huge issues. Mike, how big of a thing is this for you and your company on a day-to-day basis, the conversations you guys are having about the security of your system?
Oh, well, being in healthcare, it's a daily discussion, absolutely. So In addition to everything we've mentioned about VR and immersive technologies, patient data has to be secured. So yeah, security is a huge issue for us. Absolutely.
Yeah, really
And
good
regulatory. Some of our applications are considered to be diagnostic, so we have to go through FDA approvals and Health Canada approvals, just like any other diagnostic system. So definitely a big conversation.
Yeah.
Okay,
Bill,
I do. I have a bunch more here.
Good, keep going.
One of them is, what's the lowest footprint to support this kind of technology you kind of hinted at before in a rural environment? And if people are having trouble with transmissions on Zoom right now, how do we handle the rural environments in this kind of technology as we grow? It has to start somewhere, but how do we do that?
It's a conversation that our breakout group talked a bit about from an equity standpoint. If we've got technology gaps now, imagine what they could be if a certain portion of our population has access to these technologies and others do not. Seems like something we really need to be planning proactively to make sure that there's equitable distribution of access to these technologies. And probably now is the time to be doing that, not 5 years from now.
Yeah, I think, Mike, you mentioned the cost of the VR headsets has come down radically, right? I mean, they've almost become commoditized. And so, that's, even though some school districts, for example, are challenged to get laptops or Chromebooks or whatever at this point. So now we're adding another thing, a VR headset. But I'm curious what your experience is along these lines with, how much of this can be run on the back end of the cloud? Is it extremely, all these simulations have to be, I would think, extremely compute intensive. And so, who pays for that? How do you distribute the cost? And are there ways that we can make it less expensive for the endpoint that might be in a disadvantaged area or a developing country, and put more of the cost on the side that's serving the simulation?
Those are all great questions. A lot of what we do is optimization of our applications so that they can run completely standalone in the all-in-one headsets. So you can actually do quite a bit without access to the internet on a headset like this. Internal storage can go up to a terabyte almost. So you can pack a lot into completely standalone experiences, and then in rural areas where you may have spotty internet, you could download updates as opposed to just downloading full modules or full scenarios. So there are ways that we can deal with those type of issues so that we're not creating massive costs in terms of bandwidth and really focusing on the providing access in a way that makes the most sense for the environment that you're in. But in terms of connecting to a server, and that so long as there's internet, it's fairly trivial to do that. And depending on, again, it really depends on the application, what you're pulling from that server, or if you even need to.
Okay.
So I'll go back to technology when all of the schools did not have a T1 line in their classrooms in order to be able to even have the internet. And what the driving argument came to be is that parents stepped forward and said, look, it's my students' free and appropriate public education. So you better get a T1 line in here. And it's going to be that kind of activism from parents, I think, that will drive the education conversation the direction it needs to be heading a little bit more expeditiously.
Yeah, I don't know much on the content side, and I was curious, Mike, to get your opinion on the cost of producing content. I mean, in some cases I've seen where these very elaborate VR things where they take a human, they put sensors on them with a green screen behind them, they capture all the motions, they use that to create an elaborate video game or VR kind of simulation. Are there ways to take existing, 3D video, 2D video even, and make it into a VR thing at a cost-effective level so we don't have huge cost to produce the content?
Well, I think certainly, 3D assets have become significantly commoditized. There are software engines that are available that make development of these type of resources cost effective. Whether those are fully online engines or they are software engines like Unity. Costs of development are coming down as well. And depending on how you build your system, if it's modular enough, then once you've created sort of the base content, you can leverage that for a lot of different things. So, just to give you an example from our work, if we create a patient that is interactable, that patient can be used over and over and over again in multiple different types of scenarios. And we can basically attach different clinical procedures to that patient without having to do a lot of work on the 3D side. So it becomes sort of more data driven. So there's less on the asset side that we need to create over and over again.
Yeah, and in the medical field, maybe somebody knows the cost side more than I do, but I mean, using cadavers for medical training has to be expensive, I would think, right? So if this can to some degree replace that, would there be a cost savings there potentially? Or?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The reality is that you'll find in many pathology labs, they're not using cadavers anymore because either there are ethical concerns, people don't, aren't signing up for using cadavers for education, but they're becoming more and more difficult to come by, and so you're finding more virtual cadaver labs.
I pose to the business thinkers in the room the delivery model. So much of this content is delivered either B2G, like business to government, or B2C, business to consumer. But if you really start driving the B2E, the business to education model, and now in the student bookstore is the headset with the preloaded content, like Mike said, I think that'll help us change the access issue as well.
And check out the headset like a library book, right? I mean, in a way, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. That's great. Yeah.
Well, speaking to that, for example, in Orange County, we have distributed literally hundreds of thousands of devices to students over the last year because so many students are working remotely. I think we're going to have to start thinking about headsets in the very near future as one of the things we're going to have to start scaling. Bill, other questions there?
Yeah, another one would be with regard to, I mean, you can envision this thing where you're using it in high school, you're using it in colleges for laboratories or any kind of thing in any kind of STEM field. And how do you overcome, or has anybody given any thought to licensing issues for healthcare professionals across states or across countries, or the material and licensing of material that's being used in education or anything? Has anybody thought about that at all?
We in our group actually thought about that, but in an almost even worse case scenario, which is things like liability issues. If you could use this for remote surgery, you've got a less skilled surgeon in a remote area, and they're being guided through AR or VR, maybe by a more skilled surgeon in a different state or a different country. There's got to be layers of liability complexity there that I think would also be a challenge that I'm not sure anybody really has thought through. I don't know, Mike, have you had much experience in that?
So, I think there are analogs in more traditional telemedicine. So for example, and I'll come back to radiology because that's what I'm most familiar with, but you know, we have teleradiology services right now. And if you are a teleradiologist in Canada and you want to read cases from the US, you have to be board certified in the US, just like a radiologist would be who's living in the US. So the regulation, the government is really good at regulation. And regulations are there for a reason, and a lot of them are already applicable to these technologies if we sort of squint. But you know, during the pandemic, you know, fee codes were developed for teleconsults. So it's not, people are thinking about this, I think, and the regulatory bodies and the governments are thinking about how do we regulate these types of technologies. And I think a lot of our learning from more traditional telehealth applications will apply directly to these immersive technologies as well.
Okay, there's another question here. If you think about different people being able to develop material now, if you're going to use it in education world, and certainly as we go over and down in time, we're going to see more and more people with the ability to develop materials, maybe for some training that they're doing. But if they're able to do that, then other people are too. And so that begs the question here of how do we define the norms for interpersonal interactions in a VR, AR environment? And how do we ensure that the interactions are safe?
Amy, do you want to tackle that one?
I think the work that this group is embarking on together now is the very beginning of that. Think about back with the internet and Q, the computer using educators group. Remember? That was such a big deal. It still exists, but we laid out the framework for how we should engage with one another through digital literacy. The work of this group right now is to start building that framework and that commonality, I think.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think there's some really interesting questions around that as well. So our interaction with others. So specifically with augmented reality. So imagine, you know, a few years down the line, we have you know, glasses that can augment our world. Does it matter if my view of the world is different than your view of the world? So if I want everyone to be a fuzzy bunny, you know, as I walk by, are there any concerns there, right? And how do we come to those commonalities? Is there a concern with me being able to completely change the visual appearance of the world around me? And does that extend to things like traffic lights or other things, you know, that we've sort of all adopted as common pieces of our world, but with augmented reality, we could completely change those. Yeah, so there's some really fun questions. Even with this type of technology, being able to change our backgrounds or change our foregrounds. The lawyer, I don't know if you saw that video of the lawyer who became a cat. So exactly.
See that one of our participants.
Yeah.
Paul, that's impressive, Paul.
So going to the fuzzy bunnies. So what if you live in a world of fuzzy bunnies, but there's 2 or 3 green frogs? And I had the ability to never see a green frog. I only saw fuzzy bunnies. That's a really big question. And in fact, I was sharing with our group, Apple, their glasses that they're coming out with here eventually is going to have the ability to unsee things. So pull on that string a little bit.
Oh.
Can I jump in here for a second and pose a question? We're talking about virtual reality and augmented reality. And one of the things that Mike has kind of pointed out is a lot of this is content driven. And so I have to ask the question that kind of been dodging around this room that we kind of skipped. Are we teaching the content? who's going to produce the content? And so there are many educators in this room. There are people in the education world. I don't know of a single university in the United States currently teaching or has a VR curriculum. So we're talking about a content that is greatly needed. We all see it as a potential for the future, but are we supporting the kids to learn it? Because someone needs to make the content. And if we're not training them, what are we doing about it? We've talked about the issues of using it in schools, its application in education, how well it would benefit kids in rural areas and in disparate areas. We kind of forgot who's going to make these contents. And if this is going to grow in the future in the next 20, 30, 40 years, we're going to need a lot more people to actually make this content, yet we're not teaching it. And that's a question that probably we should have somewhere down the line, because I don't know, I can only code so many lines of code a day.
I think that would be a great topic for our next meeting, is to tap in on some of our universities and colleges from around the world. I can only speak to the work being done at UC San Diego to teaching teachers how to use this technology effectively in the classroom. But to your point, Richard, to actually develop the content is a completely different conversation. And it's one that's being had, but it's not being had at a deep enough or a fast enough level. I'd love to hear what's going on around the rest of the world.
Yeah, I have a question related to that too. There was a question here that says, what is the basic infrastructure that's required to develop content in the VR imaging to be able to design and build education materials? You know, what is required in that? And I don't know that myself, but that was a question somebody put out here.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was going to say, there's two ways we look at this problem. There's one, definitely we need to continue educating computer scientists, 3D designers, game developers. So a lot of the folks that are on our team come from a game development background. There's a lot of transferable skills there. But I think that in addition to that, there are a lot of us, who are creating platforms that make it easier for non-technical people to create the content. Now, the having my adjunct position and being in academia for some time, I'd kind of like to pose to the group, if you had a platform that made it sort of drag and drop, easy to create education content, would you use it? Because many of the professors that I know barely have time, to put together a PDF to give to their students. So would you rather have someone else creating the content with you? So, gaining that knowledge about your expertise and what you want to teach, and then creating that content? Or would you rather have tools to create the content yourself, knowing that you may not have actually time, even with a simple tool, to create that content yourself? So that's sort of a question that I'd like to pose to the group, maybe to spur a discussion. If we have
From a programmer's point of view, from a software engineer or developer's point of view, we've had this discussion for eons, at least in our industry. And the reason being is, I use this analogy kind of loosely. Computers have been around for almost 100 years now. If you consider the original computers that came out were about the size of a house. But you'll notice that we've got, our screens are thinner, our computers have gotten lighter, but there's one thing on a computer that has not changed in almost 100 years, and that's a keyboard. There's still a keyboard, and we haven't figured out a way to input information into a computer in an easy way. So software has been developed, software is continuing to be developed, but the software people that develop it is always being pulled by market forces into an environment where they pay more. Mike just mentioned about, game developers are a key component of augmented reality. The Unity engine is basically a game development engine. The XML side of it is C and C++, and you need to know how to do that. The unique thing about game development is you also have to have some sense of design and drawing. And for software guys, I can write a logic code and write it all day long, but I can't draw to save my life. So that's a very unusual trait. You have to have both. And that's a very rare commodity. And so I don't know how much you pay your employees, but I bet you EA probably pays more, than you probably would. So the talent goes where the money is. And so a lot of these young creative people are being drawn into the game environment, the game companies, and they're getting paid an obscene amount of money. And people like Mike, who are actually trying to develop software and technology for education and so forth, they're getting the leftovers. I hate saying that word, but that's kind of where it is. So,
Richard, you make really good points. I think one of the things that's really exploded in schools in K-12 in recent years is gaming, even as a competitive varsity level sport. And a lot of schools are doing really creative things with curriculum around gaming. So it's possible that that might be an entry point for the expansion of what happens with VR. And I can guarantee you that the big companies, McGraw-Hill, et cetera, are right now beginning to put together curriculum that will ultimately be based on VR platforms. So we're still in early stages. The beauty of this conversation is that it's ongoing, and such rich stuff has been raised tonight. We are kind of coming toward the end of our time together, but we already are planning for the next session. Really want to keep this conversation going. There's so many other dimensions of it that we'd like to explore. I want to take a minute to thank Mike and Amy and Tony for their terrific contribution. Big Zoom hand clap for our keynote and panelists. Thank you guys so much for leading us on this conversation, and we look forward to the next step.
Thank you, Cecilia, and wonderful to see so many smiling faces joining us this afternoon and this evening for sure. It's my privilege to unpack a little bit about what Bridge to Connect BRDG is all about. And I guess due to my upbringing, I feel if I'm going to steal, I need to do it quickly and get it out of the way. So I'm going to steal a little bit from some content I heard about our keynote speaker today, Mike Wesolowski, who has as his mission promoting the application of technology to better humanity. That's a wonderful mission in life, and in many ways it's completely apt for what BRDG is all about. Our technology is really human enterprise. We have a network of volunteers and active professionals renowned in their disciplines who provide one-on-one coaching to students who are attempting to become the first in their family to earn a college degree. And they're doing so in pursuit of a career ambitions inside STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so that's our humanity. And we're hoping that we intersect these young people at a particular and precise moment in their drive towards their future. And it's around typically junior year. So they've had some academic success, and that's in their rearview mirror, if you will. And in front of them, they're just starting to see a future take shape, career and ambitions that around their family table, and appreciate this, they have no one to relate to their experience. So in my mind and in my heart, these are true pioneers. They are folks who are handling all the academic challenges, the social challenges, and in addition to that, a whole world of unknown unknowns. And I'm sure we can appreciate that. Those of us who deal with that professionally and personally, those are the toughest kinds. So Bridge to Connect intersects these youth at just that crossroads, and we immerse these young students, pioneers, in an 18-month intensive program, one-on-one coaching, mentoring, and a suite of skills development that you may not necessarily think of, personality workshops, more traditional things like interview, career preparation and such. And we move these kids forward, hopefully, with a better sense of confidence and more equitable opportunities. And we do so at a per cost per student over that time frame of just $10,000. Very proud of that. And so I invite all of us today, if I've piqued some interest to learn more, you can reach out to any one of our BRDG people, certainly our students as well. We're all happy to talk about it and proud to do so. And I thank you for the time